Hi, Misha here, and I've recorded several videos recently on airplanes and battleships, aircraft carriers, and of course videos for the main Mishaco channel. Yeah, I just felt like doing something fun, talking about some Star Trek models. The problem is, there hasn't been much new from Eagle Moss, and in fact the collection is pretty well ended. But in this one, I thought, I've talked about freighters, cargo ships, transports, supply ships used by other races like Cardassians and even Klingons a bit, but let's talk about such ships used by Starfleet, the Earth Cargo Service, and then later the Federation, and close allies. Why not? So I've laid out a dozen models from the collection, all used, like I said, either as a freighter or a passenger ship. And to start off, we kind of start at the very beginning with the Conestoga class. I'll be honest, one reason I brought this out, this is just one of my favorite models. I think it's interesting. But in universe, this is a model of Earth's first deep space, at least at the time, colony ship, launched in 2069. So if we're going to do this, we need to kind of chop. We have less than 50 years now. It was launched right after Zefram Cochrane's first warp flight, just a few years later. You can only get up to about warp 1.3. I nearly said Mach 1.3. Like I said, I've been doing other videos. And had a crew of roughly 200 passengers. And of course, since it was a colony ship too, it carried quite a bit of cargo, supplies. If it had defenses, it didn't have much, maybe plasma cannons. And this one, the Conestoga, was meant for a one-way trip. Other ones weren't. In my own head canon, I like to think of the SS Valiant from the pilot, or rather the second pilot of the original series, as a member of this class. Kind of dates back to the old Star Trek encyclopedia. Some of you might know what I mean. But yeah, this was one of Earth's first warp large ships used in the mid-late 21st century. So it definitely falls into that camp. But not long after, we had both the Type J, or JClass, or Y-class. These are two very similar ships from Enterprise. These are the kind of long cargo ferry types that started being built around the year 2100. They had detaching pods, no shielding, and could carry 20 to 30,000 kilotons of cargo. Not very fast though, depending on the ship. They started off with a max warp of around 1.8, and others maybe warp 2. Later it said that they were upgraded by some of their owners to maybe warp 3. It does seem like they were built for the long haul and for being upgradable and reconfigurable. And it's an interesting concept. You know, after Earth would have a handful of colonies, or even just trade partners, other alien races, like the Nobulans or the Vulcans, they would need to send ships out to take and receive cargo. But at this time, warp was still relatively slow. So it would take months or even a year or more to get there, and then at the same time back, much like sailing ships were in the 19th century. And this led to these being nearly generational ships. They had families on board, and life was just on board. I'm not sure how exciting that would be to be stuck on board a ship without holodeck. If they had holodecks, which they didn't, but if they did, that'd be better. But they basically just had books. The crew amenities were fine, but nothing special. This was even before replicators, so they were eating rations, and I think it's an interesting just thought about the culture that would inherently grow up around freighter ships. It's why it's a shame that the character Mayweather never... The backstory we got, honestly, had a lot of potential and was very boring. But I think looking into that lifestyle could have been really neat. We know that ships like these would have 2 to 3 plasma cannons for breaking up space debris or defending against pirate things. And of course the cargo pods could be detached. And they trucked on for generations. Moving on, we have the JClass freighter. This is from TOS. They really like that J type name. The ship was originally featured in the episode Mud's Women, but it was just the typical glowing dot. But when they did TOS Remastered, they took the opportunity to make a model. Funnily enough, they took inspiration from Matt Jeffrey's original shuttle concept, which I have done a video on the concept shuttle, and you can definitely see some similarities. They just poofed it out. Mud ship here was named Stella. In the series, we also see a couple of other ships, including the SS Aurora, and just a beautiful episode. But definitely a sleeker design than the old ones. And whereas these older ships needed to have a crew of maybe 15 to 25 to operate them, probably cargo handling and all that, ships like this, well, outdated, could be operated honestly with the crew as few as 1, but at least more normally 6. And they weren't considered a heavy cargo freighter. They were a light cargo freighter. But they did seem to be common. Also on board one of these is where Captain Pike was disabled, at least in the real timeline. But it's a neat ship, and even though they put it in recently to keep it kind of fitting with the TOS aesthetic, it's pretty basic, but it definitely looks like a freighter ship. And these were used for both freight and personnel transport. I didn't really mention size. I guess I should have on the other ones. These are around 230 to 270 meters, so long but not very thick. One like this was much smaller, more like maybe 90 meters, but it is wider. And of course it doesn't have the external pods, so I don't know. I like TOS ships. Simple geometric designs. Here's one that's interesting that I've actually not featured on the channel. This is the ship from the movie Generations. The one that there were two of these that had Elorian refugees, aka Guinan's species. These were known as the Warfin class, and again we saw the SS Robert Fox and the SS LaCool in Generations. Unfortunately, Robert Fox didn't make it. Well, neither made it, but no one made it off the Fox, and only a handful made it off the LaCool. It's an interesting design. It's about 270 meters long. We know it could at least carry 200, but based on the size and how thick it is, I have a feeling it could carry more. And it was capable of warp 4. Now, some have said this is an Elorian design. I'm not saying they're wrong, but the fact that they were named LaCool and Robert Fox tends to point to more of an Earth registry. It's never clear. And it does kind of resemble some other human Federation allied. Either way, it's a transport in use in the late 23rd century. We see these on screen in 2393. And we have no reason to think it's not just a common passenger transport. It'd be an aging one. It definitely looks kind of old. But interesting enough design. And again, it really gives kind of that depth to the universe that not everything is a Constitution or a Galaxy class. And likewise, we have our next ship up. And the first of many Antares classes. This is the Arcos. Did a video on it. It was pretty recently released from season 4 of Next Generation. This was literally just seen on screen for a brief second. In reality, it was a reuse of an presumably alien ship, but in universe, this was a Federation, if not necessarily Starfleet ship. So, outdated, but still flying around 2367. I like the fact that it has giant boosters in the back. It's great. Hey, rockets never go out of style, right? But yeah, it was just basically to have a ship on screen that goes kaboom. Interestingly, it only had a crew of 2. Meaning, even though it's an old design, it must have been highly automated. Because it seemed to be of at least respectable size. I mean, not huge, but not shuttle size either. I kind of wanted this model ever since they announced they would do it, just because it, again, it gives kind of background ships for the Federation, and it was used for a handful of other alien ships in Season 2, so you could always use it as one of those if you're doing a setup or a display, but we really have no knowledge of it. Some people call this a Deneva class, which honestly I like better because there's so many Antares classes already, but yeah, it is what it is. Another freighter in service for humans. And then moving right along, we have Scotty's ship, well, sort of. The USS Jenolan, the Sydney class. This is kind of the 747 of Starfleet, and this does seem to be a Starfleet ship. Has their typical nacelles. It's gonna come off. Oh well. It has a typical Starfleet bridge module. In the real world, this was originally an orbital or solar system model used in the films. I've done a video on the model. It's on the shuttle model. Even then, it was a relatively large shuttle. But to make it look even bigger, they added nacelles from a Constitution or Miranda, and they added a bridge module, giving it a boxy utilitarian look, which seems to be the way of cargo and passenger ships in Star Trek. But yeah, this is the ship that Scotty was taken to, I think it was Rise. It wasn't Rise, it was a retirement colony, but I forget the name. Doesn't matter. Just throwaway name. And then it crashed into something that makes the Death Star look small. Now, how you crash into something that big? Well, on the one hand it's big, on the other hand space is really big. But it seems to have a pretty large passenger capacity of over 250. And these are still very much in use in the 2370s, because we see it at least 3 or 4 times in Deep Space Nine. And that wouldn't be the Jenolan, because it was crashed. That would be, I think it was the USS Nash, but we do see it. And based on the registry numbers, these came into service a short time after the Excelsior types, so probably 2380s. Which fits in quite well. And are just, relatively modern, probably relatively fast. Personnel transport, and I'm sure freight cargo as well. Definitely one of the neat ships, and you don't see many models of the Jenolan, which is a shame because it's from a pretty memorable episode. Next up, we have another Antares. This is, of course, a model of Cassidy Yates's SS Zozo. Now, in Deep Space Nine, this has a Patarian registry, but we know that some of these were made in human shipyards, if not all of them. So it seems to be more or less a human design. The model's actually quite heavy, so I'll take it off the stand. Yet again, it has the typical box shape. Actually very reminiscent of the J and Y types. We don't really know a scale for sure, but it's of a good size and operates with a crew of around 12 to 20. Is reasonably fast, and in the show it travels around the Bajoran system and near Cardassian space. We know that it's an older design. In fact, some elements of the bridge are kind of TOS styled, so harkening back there. Almost makes you wonder as many times as they use the name Antares if it's more of a type of ship than an actual class. Just food for thought, I suppose. But we see a couple of members of this, but the Zozo here is the big one that is featured in more than a couple of episodes. Kind of makes you wonder how, since Cassidy seemed to own it, how you buy it without money. The whole economy without money thing sounds great, but then you start thinking about the logistics and it doesn't start to make sense as much. But I digress. Next up, This is mainly here for my next video I'll be doing, but why not have the Oberth out, because this was kind of a jack of all trades ship. Well, not a warship, but it was used for a lot of secondary purposes. Science, of course. Survey. Experiment. But we also see it used as a courier and Starfleet transport more than once, probably because it was a ship that was easily available, and we see several of these that aren't even under direct Starfleet registry with an SS instead of USS prefix. So this seemed to be kind of a standard hull design. And a lot of people like to call this bottom section a engineering hull. I've always thought of it more of as a cargo pod or a sensor pod, because the ship itself just seems to be this top place here with the nacelles and bridge. Really wouldn't make a lot of sense to have your warp core way down there with your nacelles way up there. And of course, how would you even get down to it? I know people say, oh, there's a turbo lift. This is not a very big ship. Maybe about 150 meters. The scaling doesn't really work out. Pretty small crew, too. I actually like the design, even though it's basically paper. Had a very light phaser array. I think some might have had a photon torpedo or two bolted on, but yeah, they were used as transports now and again because it was a model available for TNG. But why not bring the Oberth out for a quick mention? And next up, again, I really couldn't do this video without bringing out the USS Lantry Miranda class, because this is specifically stated to be a Class 6 supply ship, meaning it was used as a transport. Very clearly so in Next Generation. Back during Wrath of Khan era, when this was considered a medium cruiser, had the roll bar, had a crew of about 200, but when they maybe retired older ships or purpose-built newer ones as supply ships, they didn't have the roll bar, and the crew was reduced to around 34, 35, 36, with the rest of the space given over for either passenger quarters or just cargo bays. And these seem to run routine supply to Federation outposts and colonies, and would have been definitely better defended than a traditional freighter, which makes sense because in the episode they were delivering stuff to a medical research facility, so a little better protected. These are actually capable of quite respectable warp speed after refits, so makes sense. Miranda class seems to be a very versatile hull. And moving along, another one that'll appear in the next video too, but I figured might as well bring it out. The SS Raven from Voyager. You can definitely tell we're getting into solidly 24th century styling here. This, of course, was famously the ship flown to their doom by the Hansons. Seemed to be a research ship, but these could also be used and were used for long-range light transports and cargo supplies. And hey, in the video game Star Trek Armada, they're used as colony ships, because why not? And it even has a little bit, in the basic lines, kind of a resemblance to the Conestoga we started with. These are only said to be 90 meters long, but at the same time they're said to have 4 decks, which I guess you could cram that in. They even have a small shuttle bay, maybe for like Type 15 shuttle pods in the back. This ship here, the Raven, was flying in the 2350s period. We don't know how old it is, but again, it looks pretty modern. Kind of has a proto-runabout look, but it would have been bigger. And they were definitely capable of long-range trips without resupply. And this would actually fit the kind of mind state of the Federation of Starfleet in the 24th century, at least prior to the Battle of Wolf 359, because it's a modern, relatively fast, self-sufficient ship designed, or at least could be crewed by as few as 2, although I'd have to assume it would have more as a general rule. But without much thought of war or even defense, just speed and technology. It's a neat model too. And it fits right in, keeping the boxy aesthetic. And speaking of boxy, we end with the boxiest box that ever did box. The Holo ship from Star Trek Insurrection, a movie that I actually like just fine. It was entertaining, if not revolutionary. Not every movie has to be Wrath of Khan. Sometimes a Voyage Home type is just fine. Anywho, in the show, in the movie, this was a holo ship, experimental, but it seems to be based on a pretty standard hull design. In real life, this design was inspired by oil tankers, hence the bridge unit. Well, originally it would have been in the back, but anyway, production. It's just a lot of internal volume. We know they could carry at least 600 passengers, and probably quite a bit more than that. Could have been adapted from a colony ship or a long-range heavy freighter, or the equivalent of a modern jumbo jet. Seems to be quite advanced and having modern warp. It also had modern shielding and whatnot, but it was not a combat ship. It was also, quite interestingly, able to land and stay on a planet's surface, which again would be useful if it were a colony ship. So I decided to bring it out because while I can understand the whole cloak part was experimental, I doubt the whole entire hull design was brand new. That wouldn't make a lot of sense for a clandestine mission. But it's one of the most recent potentially civilian or transport type ships we've seen from the films. I'm not going to speak to things like Picard. I sincerely just don't care. They've, anyway. I don't know. I just thought this might be kind of fun to look at the support ships that humans have used since the early days of the, essentially what was NASA, through the Earth Cargo Service, through the Federation during the TOS period in movies, up through the Next Generation, when frankly we mostly see older Starfleet ships repurposed for secondary roles. And then of course through Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and the TNG movies. I don't know. I've done most of these in videos, but comparing and contrasting is always fun, I think. And why not? It's actually a storming night outside, and I just wanted something fun to do that wouldn't require research and a lot of brain power. I don't know if it'll come out before or after this video, but I think the next one I'll do is look at science and survey ships that the Federation has used. Again, as I've said with other videos, the warships get all the glory, but ships like these are the ones that really do the hard, long, and often unappreciated work. Also, I think a lot of the models are neat from Eagle Moss because they're not really models that other makers have done for the most part. And I do actually like the look of quite a few of them. Some of them, like the Hollow Ship, are pretty just meh. But, like the freighters from Enterprise, I really like. And the the Warfin class, it's strangely attractive to me. And while the Stella from TOS Remastered isn't really a design I quote-unquote really like, I think they did a very good job of making it look like it fit right in with the 60s models. Anyway, what do you think? Do you like cargo ships? To be honest, if you were a captain in Starfleet, this would be probably what you would get. You would not get a Galaxy class. No. Alrighty. With that, I'll let you go. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.